Okay, welcome to the 2025 Corden Public Lecture. My name is Philip McElman and I'm the head of the Economics Department here at the University of Melbourne. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which tonight's lecture will take place, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Tonight is the 21st instalment of the Corden Public Lecture, and it honours our alumnus, Max Corden, and also a faculty member, Max Corden. Along the way, Max has visited other places or been affiliated with other places, including the Australian National University, Oxford University, and also Johns Hopkins University. At each of those stops, he's really enriched the intellectual environment, both through his research, but also through his legacy of teaching and students. And scattered among those 21 prior public lectures are a number of former students. And you wouldn't believe it, we have an addition to that list tonight, with Paola also being a former student of Max, or can claim to be a former student of Max. Max, a key feature of Max's work was his clarity and his precision, which has actually meant that despite having this long history of research and publications, while other people are no longer cited, Max is still being cited. And sort of recent examples, especially in the context of the current trade issues, by Paul Krugman and Doug Irwin, both former presenters of the public lecture, saying that Max's work, or his book on trade policy and welfare, is still the go-to reference for anyone who wants to understand the issues to do with tariffs and industrial policy more generally. Tonight's speaker is Professor Paola Conconi from Oxford University, so you can see an overlap already there. Paola is one of the leading thinkers on the International Organization of the Economy. This spans a couple of different areas. She has a very high level sort of take on things in terms of organisation, thinking about the design of international negotiations and agreements, in particular about issue linkage. So for instance, should trade policy be linked with environmental policy? Zooming down to a more micro focus, she thinks about the organisation and structure of international trade at a very granular level. This, in some sense, reflects some of the interests that Max had as well, where he was thinking about the structure of trade, and one of his enduring contributions was the concept of the effective rate of protection, where we don't necessarily focus purely on trade in final goods, but we also think about trade in intermediates. The overlap with Paola is that she thinks about these issues not just as trade that crosses borders, mediated through markets, but she also thinks about the extent and the important extent to which trade is mediated through or within multinational firms. So we have this sort of coexistence of flows, some of those mediated through the market, but some of those also mediated through international structures. Having this high-level view of the way that countries should coordinate their trade policies and policies more general, but also then thinking systematically about the structure of trade, naturally leads to the question of, well, how do those firms themselves influence the composition and the level and nature of the trade policy itself, which will be the topic of tonight's presentation. At the end of the lecture, there will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. I'll ask you as we go through to hold your questions until then, but also think about the questions that you're going to ask. So one of the hallmarks of Max's style was it was very clear and very concise. So as question askers, I would ask you to sort of reflect that as well. So we're honoured to have Professor Conconi here tonight, and I will now turn it over to you.
Switch this on. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Wow. So thank you so much, Phil, for the invitation. And let's see if I can master the technology. Okay. So it is actually truly an honor to be here. It's my first time in Australia, and I'm very happy to be here, but I'm also honored in particular to give the Corden Lecture, because indeed I had several connections with Max. One that was already mentioned, I was a student in the mid-90s of international relations before my master and PhD in economics at SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and Max was the most beloved, he was always the most, his course, you had to queue up to attend, and he was bringing Krugman, he was bringing people, he was an incredible presence. And the second thing is, of course, his teaching and his work, international trade, on trade policy, his work on effective rate of protection. He has done really seminal work that has influenced, through my studies, the topics of my research. And finally, I ended up at Oxford, which is a place where Max spent, I think, 9 years between the 60s and the 70s. And so, yeah, I feel very honored to be here. And I put up here a quote from the FT. There was an article that was written when he passed in 2023 that really, I think, summarizes what we all think about him, that he was really a world-leading thinker in international economics. And although he was mostly a theorist, his work was really always grounded in the real world. And so I think this is something we should all aspire to, and that's what I strive to do. So today's lecture is going to be starting as a motivation with the real world and key trends that we have witnessed in trade policy in the last few decades. So the first trend is a trend for more liberalization. So if we think about the mid-90s, 1995, actually exactly 30 years ago, was when the WTO was established. So the GATT became the WTO, a much bigger and deeper organization, which has in the meantime, in the last 30 years, expanded with key accession like China in 2001, for example. Through the GATT WTO system, we have had rounds of multilateral liberalization and reduction in multilateral tariffs. And of course, we have had also reduction in tariffs at the bilateral regional level through the proliferation of regional trade agreements. So this is all a push for reduction in trade barriers, and that's the first trend. But at the same time, we have seen a widespread use of protectionist measures of all sorts. So there are trade barriers that can be used within the context of the multilateral trade system, anti-dumping, safeguards, countervailing duties. There are lots of non-tariff barriers, take product standards, for example, but more recently, and that's a much more recent trend, I would say since the first Trump administration, we have had a widespread use of special tariffs that are actually not consistent with WTO rules, and this has led to retaliation. So there are these two trends for more liberalization and more protection that really coexisted, and what a lot of my work in this area has been about is trying to understand what are the political economy forces that shape these trade policy outcomes. And so I was trying to think what I should focus on in my 45 minutes, and I realized I have far too much work, and this is ongoing and recently published papers. So I've decided to focus today on two projects. I'm not going to do anything formal, but I'm going to sketch to you two projects that are one recently published, one ongoing, that are related to different factors that drive trade policy. On one hand, I present a paper that talks about lobbying and how firms shape trade policy outcomes. And then the second project I'll talk to you about is instead talking about re-election motives, electoral incentives of incumbent politicians, and how those can also shape the trade policies we observe. So let me start from the first project, which is with a former student of mine, Michael Blanca-Gobay, who is now at the WTO, and Matteo Parenti, who is in Paris at PSE. And this is a paper exactly about lobbying, and it's a paper about lobbying on free trade agreements. So if we look at this picture, I actually took this morning from the WTO, so it's the most recent picture of regional trade agreements. So there are now, let me put my glasses, 375 as of today in force, so this is the black line, and many more are being negotiated. By the way, I was looking at Australia, and Australia is really a broad network of FTAs, in chronological order, New Zealand, Singapore, up to the UK, the most recent agreement. So countries have negotiated all these free trade agreements, which imply reciprocal elimination of tariffs under Article 24 of the GATT. So if two countries, Australia and Singapore, negotiate an FTA, they eliminate all tariffs in all sectors reciprocally. So what Daniel Roderick, in a paper in the Journal of Economic Literature, it was not a technical piece, it was like reviewing the literature and providing his thoughts about the political economy of trade agreements. He was saying, well, if we look at the political economy today, it looks like it's driven by politically connected multinational firms on the export side who push for trade liberalization rather than being driven by protectionist interests. So this was maybe surprising in the light of existing literature. If you think about the political economy of trade literature, the key view is one that is very much exemplified by the protection for sale model of Grossman-Helpel in the mid-90s, which is, you expect somewhat very strong resistance to trade liberalization, and then that really protectionist interests would dominate. And this has been a very widespread view in the political economy of trade policy. However, I would argue this view really doesn't apply to free trade agreement. It really applies more to unilateral sector-specific policies. Think about, for example, if you are a US car company, GM, say, if you're looking at a unilateral policy that applies to your goods, a car tariff, a tariff on car, then you may be indeed very much in favor of protection and not of liberalization, because you'll be eliminating this tariff will simply increase competition and you will not gain anything. But if you think about free trade agreements, say the US signing a free trade agreement with Korea and eliminating all tariffs on all sectors, then the same company, GM, may actually be in favor of the free trade agreement, because although this would also entail the elimination of the tariff on its final good, so imports from Korea will come at zero tariff. However, Korea will also eliminate the tariff on the car, so you'll get better access to the foreign consumers. And on top of it, if you're a large company like multinational, you're not like a GM, you will not only be an exporter, but also an importer of inputs. So the fact that the FTA covers all sectors means you could get cheaper inputs, say cheaper steel, car parts. So you can see that when you move from the logic of a unilateral sector-specific policy, which a lot of the previous literature has focused about, to a free trade agreement, which is reciprocal and multi-sector, you could have firms pushing for such agreements, particularly if they are large companies that are both exporters and importers, and they can benefit, they can take advantage of this better access to foreign consumers and suppliers. So what we do in this paper is three things. First of all, we collect novel data, very rich data on lobbying by firms on free trade agreements. This is made possible by the fact that in the US, since the mid-90s, there is the Lobbying Disclosure Act that allows you to really look in every quarter what every company, or also other industry association, trade unions, spend on specific topics I'll explain to you. But this allows us to really look at lobbying expenditure by firms on free trade agreements, and not only code how much they spend, but in which direction, in favor or against the ratification of a particular trade agreement. And when we look at the evidence, so when you look at the data that we have put together, what really is striking is the overwhelming majority of lobbying is in favor, a bit in line with what Roderick has been saying. And this is very striking. I'll show you the facts that come out of the data are very striking. You have really a few firms that are multinational firms that are the key players. Industry association, unions spend a fraction of what individual firms do, and all the firms that lobby are multinationals, and they lobby in favor. So it's very striking, and existing models cannot explain these findings because they don't have heterogeneity, firm heterogeneity. So existing model of political economy either are models that look at industry lobbying, or if they are firms, they're homogeneous firms. So what we have then, the third contribution, is to have a model of endogenous lobbying on trade agreements by heterogeneous firms that can explain, rationalize our findings. I'm not going to provide any, I'm not going to go through the model, but I'm just going to give you the key ingredients to explain the empirical findings. So let me tell you about the data, because the data is fascinating. If there are students here who are interested in political economy, this kind of data can be used to look at lobbying on all sorts of issues. And I understand, talking to Maria, that similar data may exist for Australia. We'll discuss, we can discuss later, maybe in the Q&A. So what was done in earlier study, empirical studies on lobbying, was to use data on campaign contribution, PACs in the United States. This is good data, but it has some drawbacks. And for the reasons I'll explain in a second, what recent studies have done is to use data on lobbying expenditure available through the Lobbying Disclosure Act. And so what are the two advantages of using these LDA reports rather than looking at lobbying contribution? Well, the first, and I think most important, is the fact that, as I'll show you in a second, when you look at lobbying reports, you can really trace the issues that are targeted by the lobby. So you can see a company lobbying on antitrust, IPR protection, trade agreements. You can see the specific issues lobbied. When you look at campaign contribution, if you have a company contributing to the campaign of a politician, you don't know what policy this company is trying to influence. Now, it could be antitrust, migration, trade, whatnot. So it's much harder to establish the link to the policy. And also, secondly, as you can see here, if you look at total, in red you have total lobbying expenditure, and in blue you have campaign contribution. Lobbying expenditure are really the main channel of influence. So for all these reasons, in this paper, we are looking at reports filed through the Lobbying Disclosure Act, the LDA, and the LDA really requires all individuals who try to affect federal policies, any federal agencies, to disclose on a biannual, now it's every quarter, before 2008 it was every semester, but you have to provide very detailed information on your lobbying activities, and there are significant penalties for violation of the LDA requirements. So lobbying is very broadly defined. It can be any effort to influence the thinking of legislators or any policies. And so this could be you meet with politicians, you create a workshop in which you advertise, the TPP is great, we should push. It's really any financial expenditure linked to influence policy. So what we do is, in this paper, focus on lobby reports that are about the ratification, or we also have done the negotiation, I don't have the time to show you those robustness checks, but of free trade agreements. In other projects, I'm looking with other co-authors are lobbying on anti-dumping, for example. That's a very different type of policy, so you would expect a different kind of political economy. Here it's going to be about free trade agreements. And so we have collected all reports filed by firms, and I'm going to give you examples in a second, that are about free trade agreements. And in particular, we can look at the ratification bill numbers. So this is a good way to trace in the lobbying reports. You can say, okay, we know when these agreements are negotiated and voted in Congress. So if you have an agreement that is signed, say, any agreement that the US president signs has to be ratified, and there will be a bill number that you can look for. Or we can look for keywords as an alternative way to trace lobbying on particular trade agreements. If you look at the lobbying expenditures, we have collected it on trade agreements. We have collected it not just for individual firms, but individual firms are the key players. So again, previous models thought that industries were the key players. You would have the textile industry lobbying, or the steel industry, or the car industry. Here you see that within an industry, it's only very few firms that participate, and now we know, the previous generation of models were written in the mid-90s, before the Mellitz revolution, now we all know there's so much heterogeneity within industry across firms, and you can see it in the politics. So it's not industries that lobby, because within the textile industry, you could have Nike, which has very different interests than small textile and apparel producers. So clearly, it's about individual firms, the large ones, that are really spending. And so we're going to focus, what I'm going to show you today is lobbying by individual firms, which spend anyway much more than labor unions and industry associations. Okay, so let me give you, I'm going to put all up and give you an example in a second. So what you have in this lobbying report is really rich information. So you know the name and address of the company, you know how much they spend, and you know in this section 16 of the report, so you have section 15 is the broad issue, trade being one of them. So first we look at whether it's a trade-related lobbying report, and then within trade you can write down in section 16 the specific issues lobbied. And so let me give you an example. I don't know if it's a bit blurred, so those who are far won't see, but this is an example just to see the kind of rich data. So let's see if the pointer works, no? But at the top you have the registrant name, that's PMI, Philip Morris International. So this is then what is highlighted below is self, which means that the company itself filed the report. Sometimes you have the company hiring a lobbying firm in K Street, and then in this case you will have the report. It will simply not be self, but you will have the lobbying company filing with the name of the firm being the client. But in any case, you'll catch the report. So you will have that. In this case, is Philip Morris International through its in-house lobbying department that is filing this report. Then you have the date and the quarter. So this particular case was a report filed in the third quarter, Q3 of 2008, and then below you have the expenditure, so you have a bit more than $1 million. So this is in the third quarter of 2008, Philip Morris International spent a bit over $1 million to lobby on what? As you can see here, you have TRD in section 15, so that's trade, the code for trade, and then the specific issues lobbied are the ratification of the US-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And so all our, the lobbying reports in our data set will have, here is some more examples. So you have like a firm spending in a particular quarter on a particular trade agreement, and here are other examples of, for example, what's interesting, you have company like US Steel, which you connect to lobbying for protection, but in this case, again, we are not talking about anti-dumping or safeguard. We are talking about a free trade agreement with Korea, and this is a company that is there lobbying for the implementation of the agreement. So what is the first fact that is very striking that comes out of this data set is that when you look at the firms, the lobbying on FTAs, the overwhelming majority, we are talking about 99.25% of the cases, firms lobby in favor. So you expect, based on the literature, a lot of protection, but when you look at the selected firms that are, they're really politically active, that are the ones spending on these issues, they're all in favor. It's all blue. You have a slice of red, which I think is a couple of companies that, lobbied against Colombia, or it's like one agreement, but actually the same companies are in blue because this is firm agreement in other. So if you were to ask, is there a company that always lobbies in favor, there will be none. So it's very striking and very robust. So this is done based on ratification bill numbers, but if I recollect all the data based on keywords, for example, which would allow you to capture the lobbying, not just at the end when there is already a ratification bill number, but during the negotiation you get always around 98, 99. So it's very robust. We have done many robustness, which I'm not going to show you, but it's very striking. What you also see, which is much less surprising, is that if you compare lobbying and non-lobbying firms, we can match our data set, lobbying data set with, say, Compustat here. What you see is that although Compustat is already a data set with publicly listed firms, or large firms, those that lobby on free trade agreements are, you see the distribution of sales here is shifted to the right. So they're much larger than the non-lobbying firms. And this is true if you look at the distribution of sales or employment. So you already see the selection. These are not random firms. These are firms that are much larger. What you also see, which I didn't put here, is that most of these firms that lobby are multinational companies. So we have a way, again, by merging our data with Compustat, we can code whether the firm is domestic or multinational, and the overwhelming majority are multinational. In terms of the intensive margin, you can also look at how much they spend on individual trade agreements. So there's variation. So what I showed you so far was, extensive margin in the jargon. So is who is participating, who is lobbying. And these are firms that are lobbying in favor, and they're overwhelmingly large, mostly multinational companies. Then in terms of when you zoom into, okay, this is a selected set of firms that participate in the process, but there's variation in how much they spend across agreements. So what you see is that they spend more when they have more to gain, So in terms of improved access to foreign consumers and foreign suppliers, so you can look at tariffs. We look at, so for example, if there is an agreement with a small country like Panama, you're going to get, the stakes are much smaller than if it's an agreement with Korea. But also it's not just the size of the market that matters, but also the level of the pre-agreement tariffs that are going to be eliminated. So we measure that, and we can see that the firm spends more, the more it has to gain based on how much it exports from to a market and imports from. And so this is going to be, if the agreement goes through, the tariffs will be eliminated, and so you will have improved access to foreign consumers and suppliers. And instead, the lobbying in favor, because these are all lobbying in favor, is reduced if there is a bigger increase in import competition. So that's the negative effect that you have, because of course you're also eliminating tariffs on your final good in your domestic market. The final fact that comes out is on the politics. So what we can do is to measure expected opposition to ratification of the trade agreements, and we can do this in two ways that political scientists have used to measure this in the US context. So the first is to look at whether or not ratification happens in the US Congress, where you have, of course, the House and Senate, and so you have the president who brings to the Congress the bill for ratification, and what has been shown in the literature is if you have a divided government, meaning that the executive is from a party and one of the two chambers are from the other party, is much less likely that the bill goes through, because you'll have the politicians from the other party who resist. So we see that we take this as a proxy of expected resistance to the ratification of the trade agreement, and also the share of protectionist legislators in Congress, so which we measure in a way that I can describe later if you want. So the more you expect that the bill will have resistance in Congress, the more the firms spend. So this is what we have in terms of the data. And if you think in what comes out of our new data set on lobbying on free trade agreements, and if you take any of the models from the shelf, not just Grossman-Heltman 94 or 95, the key papers from the 90s, but also more recent papers, also Matilde Bombardini's job market paper, for example, which had firms, but none of these models have heterogeneous firms, so they cannot explain the key findings. So what you really see is that you don't have opposition. So you don't have small firms lobbying against. These firms are simply not active. So you need a model that allows you to explain selection into lobbying, and by heterogeneous firm and by the winners of globalization of trade agreements, which are the large multinational companies. So that's what we do. So we have the economic structure of the model builds on the literature on firm heterogeneity in trade. So for those of you who are not in trade, there's been really a revolution from the late 90s, early, so there have been a few empirical papers in trade in the late 90s that have clearly shown, now that we can observe firm level trade, we can see is that a few firms are driving all aggregate trade flows, and a few firms are exporters, a few firms are importers. It's not that we shouldn't look at the industry as something homogeneous. So we are building on the literature, which has shown selection into all the margins of trade, exporting, importing, foreign direct investment. And so that means that there's going to be some firms can take advantage of FTAs and some don't. If you are domestic firms that doesn't export and doesn't import, because they are fixed costs, you're too small to be able to cover the fixed cost of exporting and importing, then you are not going to benefit from the FTA, because the only thing you're going to have is suffer increased competition in the domestic market. If instead you're a large firm that is selecting into all the margins of trade, then you can have the better access to foreign consumers and suppliers, and these gains offset the increased competition in the domestic market. So this is just simply, this part of the model shows you that you can have these distributional effects of FTAs across firms, with the most productive firms, the ones that are selecting into the various margins of trade, that are going to gain from the trade agreements. And their stakes are much larger in absolute terms than the losses of the small firms. So you have small firms that lose, but these, in absolute terms, the losses are small. And that's key, because then together with fixed cost of lobbying, you then can explain the key findings, the blue pie chart that I showed you. Because if you have then that being politically active, whether it's setting up your own in-house lobbying department or hiring lobbying firms that do the job for you. It's costly. You know, if you are a firm that is small and loses, your stake could be large, you could be wiped out. But still, relative to in absolute terms, relative to the fixed cost, you're not going to be, we show, this is a model, the second part of endogenous selection into lobbying. You see that it's the firms that gain the most that are going to be the ones from the FTA that are going to be the ones that select both into trade and select into lobbying. So you really have a rationale for this very striking fact one, which was this pie chart that is all blue. The model can also explain variation on the intensive margin. The firms that do lobby in favor would lobby more when they have more to gain. So that's obvious. But also the model has this key feature here. The politicians could be biased in favor of against. And this is a contest model where there is uncertainty about the outcome. So you lobby under uncertainty, which is another difference compared to, say, Grossman and Heldman, where there's no uncertainty there. What happens in the traditional model, you spend, you know, if Maria is the politician I'm trying to influence, I'm paying, you know, I'm offering campaign contribution. It's a binding promise that if you, you know, if you get elected, if you have a choice, then you deliver the policy that is corresponding to my. So there is really there's full commitment in Grossman and no uncertainty. Here, it's a model with uncertainty, which can then explain why you would have firms putting a lot of effort. For example, if there's more uncertainty about the agreement going through, you will spend more money. So there is uncertainty about the politician's stance on the policy, and the more you think that they are biased against, the more you will spend to push the issue through. So I think what's nice is a very elegant, simple model. If you want to look at it, it's there. I'm not going to put any equations, but the model does the job of explaining the very striking facts that come out from our data. So let me move to, so this is in a way, so when going back to the big picture, so I said, okay, there are policies, different policies you observe, trade liberalization forces. Here you saw that indeed what you can, you know, part of the big push for trade liberalization in the last few decades has been the fact that firms have fragmented the production process, they become multinational, become larger, and they're the ones who are, you know, on the lobbying side dominating the game. So that partly explains this big push towards liberalization, in particular liberalization at the level of FTAs. There is, of course, this is not to say that lobbying is all there is. I think what is very clear, particularly in recent years, is that electoral incentive and what voters want has become important. But this was something that people, by the way, for a long time thought voting doesn't matter. It's all about lobbying on trade policy. Why? Because people thought trade policy is not salient enough for people to vote based on trade policy. So this was a presumption in the literature for a long time. You know, if you're a voter and you're in a representative democracy, you vote to re-elect your incumbent politician or to go for the challenger, you're not going to make that decision. You make the decision on a bundle of policies. And trade is not going to be a key policy. You'll vote on taxation, education. But what you clearly see, and this is not so much in this project, but in a series of other projects, that trade, it's enough that trade is salient for a few voters in the economy, like a single issue minority that really cares about it, is cared about the jobs. Politicians will be accountable to these voters. So let me anyway zoom into this project. So I've much more to say about re-election motives, but I want to just tell you about this ongoing project. So here is a few anecdotal examples of like elections mattering, voting, electoral incentive mattering. Again, this is going against the presumption in the literature that because trade policy is a secondary policy issue, as in the words of Tim Beasley, it's all about lobbying. In reality, you see examples of voting and electoral incentive being key. So the first example is Obama, where just before his first election, when he was campaigning against Hillary Clinton, he said, NAFTA has been devastating. The worst thing the United States has negotiated, has been I don't think it has been good for America. I never had. And then, of course, once he was elected, it didn't change anything. And he actually admitted that his rhetoric on NAFTA has been overheated and amplified, and we're always guilty of that. So he basically admitted that, he had just for electoral reasons taken this very protectionist stance. Similarly, when he was running for re-election, Obama, just I think in September of 2012, so like a month and a bit before, he went to Ohio, a swing state, and said, okay, we are going to file a dispute at the WTO against subsidization of car parts in China. So against China for subsidizing car parts. And there was an article on The Economy saying, oh, this is a suspiciously timed trade dispute because, surprise, surprise, Obama does it just before re-election when it was known that China had been subsidizing car parts throughout his term. So he does it just at the right time, and he goes to Ohio, a key swing state, to announce this dispute. And there are other examples. So we know, and I've worked on other papers to show that there is clearly a protectionist bias, so driven by electoral incentives. So if you're a politician, you know that most voters don't really care enough to make you accountable on trade, but there is a minority of voters, more or less sizable, but a minority in the electorate. It's not the median voter, but who are highly protectionist, and you, particularly close to re-election, you're going to be taking a protectionist stance. But today I'm going to talk not so much about electoral proximity. I'm going to talk about swing state politics, which is still related to electoral incentives. So what you have in the United States, as you probably all know, is that the president is not elected by popular vote by all citizens, but citizens vote for one of the two presidential candidates in their state. So they vote for the Democratic or the Republican candidate. Then whoever wins a state gets all electors. So if you get a majority of votes, say in California or in Ohio, and you are, I don't know, a Republican, then no, in California is most likely going to be a Democrat. And so even if you get just 51%, all electors in all electoral votes from California will go to the Democratic Party, and whoever wins Ohio, the party, even if you win by a little margin, you get all votes. So this is not the principle of one citizen, one vote. It creates this incentive, perverse incentive, to favor swing states. So these are states in which you could win, just by winning a little bit, you win all votes. So you know, if you're a politician, that if you campaign, that there are states that you're expected to win no matter what. So if you're a Democrat today, California is safe. So there's not much point putting effort in campaigning and in terms of policy favors on states that you're going to win for sure or lose for sure. But instead, you're going to have a race to win votes in the states that could change the outcome in the electoral college. So this is known in terms of, like, there is a key seminal paper by David Stromberg in 2008 AER that shows that, for example, swing state politics affects campaigning. And we also have electoral anecdotal evidence that swing state politics affect trade policy. But this is the first paper that provides systematic evidence that actually policies, trade policies of incumbent politicians are shaped by swing state politics. So this is two examples from George W. Bush's first term. So in his first term, he introduced various measures, key safeguards on various countries, including China, in steel. And this was linked, of course, to the fact that in that term, Ohio and Pennsylvania were expected to be swing states in the next election. And so this was very much seen as a way to win votes in those states. And in the same term, he also went after furniture, put anti-dumping, I think, on furniture. And again, this was seen by the New York Times. Wisconsin was expected to be swing, and furniture was a key import, and they were worried about competition from China. So he went and introduced this measure. But so this was perceived effect of swing state politics on temporary trade barriers, meaning anti-dumping safeguards and countervailing duties. What I'm going to show you is that there is actually perverse, systematic evidence that these electoral incentive, these incentive to favor voters in swing states really affect trade policy in the US. In particular, these temporary trade barriers, they can be, now you shouldn't look for swing state politics in MFN tariffs, these very permanent tariffs. But if you look at things that can be changed easily, like anti-dumping, safeguards, and countervailing duties, these temporary trade barriers, that's where you're going to find evidence. And what is key is that, why do you worry? Because this is politically motivated trade protection. It's not optimal trade policy. It's policy that is really driven by electoral incentive of an incumbent politician who wants to win in the electoral college. And this can really be detrimental. If you are going to go and impose measures on steel just to win votes in Ohio and Pennsylvania, these could have obviously repercussions for manufacturing downstream firms, say in the car industry, but also non-manufacturing, say the construction industry. So what we are going to do is to first put together this new data set on all the temporary trade barriers that have been introduced by the United States since the 1980s. And here my co-author is, one of my co-authors is Chad Bown, who has done an incredible, is the reason why this data exists in the first place. And so we put this together with input-output linkages, data, very detailed data on input-output linkages, because we are interested in looking at how these policies can propagate along supply chains. So here, if you want, it's a bit different from the previous paper, where here, before we were saying, okay, how firms and their economic interests affect the politics. Here, we are looking at how voters and electoral incentive affect the policies and how these can have repercussions for firms. So the main focus of the paper is also measures that are targeted against China, which is by far the biggest target of US TTBs anyway. We have a robustness in which we look at other countries. And what we are going to do is to identify the effects of this politically motivated protection along supply chains on directly exposed industry, the protected industry, and those that are linked to those, exposing directly through input-output linkages. We are going to use an instrumental variable strategy that is really relying on variation in the identity of swing states across electoral terms, across elections. So this is a map that is based on a new measure we use. So we have different measures. Let me put the, oops. You see something went wrong. I gave my PDF file, and they transformed it into a PowerPoint, and now you don't see some things. It's okay. I'll read to you. So what I'm plotting here is which states have a high probability of being decisive swing states in a given election based on Stromberg probabilistic voting model. So this model can predict, so you can estimate the model and get a measure of which states are expected to have a probability of being decisive in the electoral college. So notice that there are elections like in 1996 when Bill Clinton was president at the time, and he won by a really wide margin. So no state there could have made a difference in the electoral college. So there are states, there are elections in which they're really not very competitive at all, and so no state is swing. So there, in fact, you're actually using that variation because Bill Clinton didn't have to play the game. He didn't have to manipulate trade policy to win votes. There are other elections where the outcome is much more close, and where states, here you see the variation, there's some states that can make the difference. There's a probability they can change. By winning these states, you can change the whole race. So we are using, and again, you don't see because my file has been changed, but we are using basically Stromberg measuring in this map, but we are using the paper other thing. We can use polls, data, and other things to predict which states are expected to be swinging a given term. Then what do we do with that? We need to link the importance of state in a given term to the importance of industry, the political importance of industry. So what we do to construct our instrument is to look at, basically it's going to be for those who are the economists here, it's going to be a shift share instrument in which the shifters are these political shocks, the changes in the identity of swing state, and the shares are going to be the importance, initial predetermined importance of an industry in a state. And what you can see is that this instrument does a very good job at predicting variation even within industry across terms in these trade protections. So again, a given industry will get more protection when its when certain states in which this industry is important are expected to be swing in the next election. So this has a very good predictive power. So showing you that already that's a first contribution. If you want the systematic evidence, in line with the anecdotal evidence I gave you before, that swing state politics in the US, this very weird system of electing the executive, means that the executive is manipulating trade policy to favor particular industries that are important in the states I cannot say he or she because there's no she yet, wants to win. What is also interesting is that this is an effect that only is there in first terms. So this is again in line with what I expected, also based on a previous model of, that I've written with other co-authors, because if you're a lame duck, meaning if you're in the second term and you cannot be re-elected, you shouldn't have any incentive to manipulate trade policy to win votes in swing states. So what you see very systematically, again, if you want later, for those who want me to look, I can show you, it's very systematic that in first terms, no matter what measure of swing state you use, we do many robustness, there's a very strong, our instrument predicts which industry get protected, but in second terms, it doesn't work, which is what you would expect. And then we can have, once we have this very strong instrument, we can look at the effects of politically motivated protection along supply chains. And what is very clear is that you have gains in the industry you protect. So in terms of employment growth, you have higher employment growth in those terms when you're protected, thanks to these politically motivated protections. If you are still in a particular term and you get an increase in safeguards or anti-dumping, employment growth in the protected industry increases. And this is the results of 2 SLS. So these are we can take our estimates as causal effects. And we do, by the way, the latest round of shift share, Boris et al. And everything. So it's super robust. And again, you see the expected gains in terms of employment growth in the industry that are protected, but you also see employment losses in the downstream industry. And these we are talking about. So the protected industry are always in manufacturing, of course, because these are traded goods. But those that suffer the cost of protection are both manufacturing industry that are downstream, say, again, the car industry in the case of steel, but also industries that are non-manufacturing, take construction, which is a big, big industry. There is a service industry, cannot be protected, there's no trade in construction, but can suffer a lot if a key input like steel, for example, is protected. And so overall, we can do a counterfactual, Acemoglu et al., with our 2SLS estimates, and what our counterfactual estimates imply is net job losses. If you get the entire US economy over this period, 1993-2016, so we stop at Trump, we can do a robustness with Trump, but you get, again, in terms of net job losses, more than 1 million, which, again, I don't want to take this particular number, but what is key is that they are net job losses. So this is politically motivated protection that favors the key industries that are politically important when you want to win those states, but they have clearly negative repercussions along the way. And there's also the last part of the paper where we dig into the mechanism. So we find that with the same IV strategy that when you, you can predict trade protection, this trade protection leads to reduce imports in the targeted industry, as you would expect, and increase prices. Increase prices in the industry you protect and increase input prices, so cost of production for the downstream industries. So I think I'm done. I wanted to just say, so what I've showed you today is, first of all, that there is a lot of, so trade policy is influenced by interest groups, but actually it's no longer the interest group we thought, industries, it's really firms and large firms. And when it comes to free trade agreements, they are overwhelmingly in favor because they have a lot to gain. And when we look at other policies, which I haven't showed you, but there you find what you expect based on the traditional logic, that if you're looking at unilateral trade policies, anti-dumping, on your sector, only by your, no reciprocation by the other country, there you find that the large firms will lobby in favor of protection. And there is a lot of evidence, and I have some of my ongoing projects maybe in line with some of your interest, on lobbying on these non-tariff barriers, the regulatory, the production standards, the intellectual property. So again, the same big suspects, when they lobby on trade agreements, they don't lobby only on the tariff side, they lobby on the deep content and the regulation, and they lobby to buy their preferred regulation. So this is something I didn't show you, but it's part of this ongoing agenda on the lobbying side. And when it comes to the elections, again, against the presumption that it's all about lobbying, no, elections matter. Voting, accountability to voters, at least some voters, is key. What I showed you today briefly is that, for example, the electoral incentive lead in the United States to the swing state bias, and in other work that I've done, there's also a clearly protectionist bias and a recency bias. You're going to do these things at the end when it matters more for your re-election. I'm going to finish this with a note that is a bit disconnected from today's lecture, but it's something we all have in mind these days, which is, so if we look at the last 30 years, so we have 30 years exactly since the WTO was established, it's looking a bit doom. I was in Geneva recently, and so we have put together a system. We have put a system to avoid going back to the 1930s and these trade wars. They were triggered by the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. So you had the US that started this wave of tariffs and then retaliation, and we got into these trade wars that didn't help, and maybe didn't cause the Great Recession, but definitely didn't help recovery. So we thought we had learned the lesson. We put together, post-World War II, a system of rules with the GATT first and the WTO to prevent going back to trade wars and to regulate what kind of measures we can use and what kind of measures we should avoid, and have a dispute settlement system. And of course, if you look at the world trading system today, we are very concerned. You have, of course, a lot of geopolitical tensions we didn't have a few years ago. And there's, again, since 2018, a lot of the measures are not the anti-dumping safeguards. These are, anti-dumping, for example, is super widely used by everyone, but there is an agreement on anti-dumping in the Uruguay-Rwanda agreement. It's something allowed. There are rules about how to use these things. The new measures, the Liberation Day tariff or whatever, they're just unilateral and totally off the books. And when it comes to the WTO, the dispute settlement system, which was really a system, it was a way to work out with panel and a panel body decision. There's still some dispute being resolved, but there's no more appeal because there's no more appellate body. So, the concern is that, we may be going back to the 1930s, which should not be good news. So, this is food for thought maybe for our Q&A, and let me stop there. Stay here.
All right, thanks, Paola, for that fascinating talk and forensic analysis of political economy, the two tracks, both the sense of direct lobbying, but also then the political motives. So we do have a bit of time for Q&A, and we've got people with
Microphones?
microphones running around, so yeah, hands up and we'll see if we can, yeah, of course, it's up. One up the front here, up the front in the middle.
You can just talk.
Thank you, Professor, that was awesome. How do you see the concentration of AI development and data control in a few US companies, OpenAI, Meta, affecting other countries' ability to maintain digital sovereignty? And are current trade frameworks equipped to handle this imbalance?
Should I take a few or reply to these? I'll let me, while the microphone goes, I'll try to have a go. I don't have much to say because I like to say things when I know a lot, and I don't know a lot about AI and AI regulation. The only thing I can say is that we have some agreement on trading services and digital services, but not at the multilateral level. The EU is trying to do a lot, but it's all at the beginning. So it's a question that is key, but I don't think we know enough. We don't have enough data. The policies are not that yet there. Definitely there is a dominance by a few firms. No, I don't think, again, I'm not an expert, I don't think only the US, I think China is another leader of AI. I was last week in Boston, and Josh Lerner from Harvard Business School was showing evidence of AI innovation in China that was quite scary. So I don't know if it's all concentrated in the US, but clearly it's concentrated in a few leading firms, and it's a concern. But I'm as concerned as you, and I don't have answers to your question.
Thank you so much for the talk today. Thinking about recent actions by the Trump administration on trade policy, if you were to think about a model to explain Trump's behavior, what would the key elements be? It's clearly not just lobbying. Electoral incentives may play some role, but there's obviously, I think there's something else around maybe culture and ideology or identity playing a role. And also, your work is really exposing flaws in the trade policy formation process. And so, what changes do there need to be in the formation of trade policy so that it is actually welfare enhancing, which I think then plays into the question you have here about saving the system, because I think right now a lot of people feel like it's rigged in favor of the elites or large corporations, which you've showed evidence that is the case.
Okay, so on Trump, it's very hard to have a model. I don't think there are now many people working on the effects of which is already very hard, on the effects of his policies. And the main thing is there's so much uncertainty. I mean, uncertainty is bad, but I think it's very hard to even keep track, because if I look at the tariffs today, are not going to be the tariffs tomorrow, and then he's negotiating all these trade deals, which are not proper trade deals, and we don't know anything about what they contain. So it's very hard to measure things, and it's very hard to understand what drives what he does, because he keeps changing. One thing, I think that both, however, going back to the key factors that I discussed today, I think both electoral incentive, the voters' preferences, and lobbying play still a role. So if I think, I didn't tell you very much, but one of the things that for me is striking, when you look at surveys on trade policy, trade preferences, most surveys simply ask, are you pro-trade or anti-trade? So you'll get what the median voter, are you protectional? And that's fine, and sometimes the median voter in different countries at different times may have different preference. But what matters is not what the median voter wants. Going back, because trade policy is not salient to the majority of the electorate. So the majority of the electorate will make politicians accountable on other policies. But a few surveys ask not only about the direction of preferences, but the intensity of preferences. And there, what you see is that if 14–15% of the respondents say trade policy really matters to me, those 15%, they are like 90% protectionist. So again, I think the base of Trump, and I don't know how large it is, but there is definitely a correlation between direction and intensity, and those who are, supporting Trump are very much those who feel, have lost their jobs, maybe in particular swing states, in steel, but they're definitely voters who are happy to be protected, and people who are employed in other industries that may suffer from protection may not care enough about this. They may care about other policies more. So I think in preference intensity matters a lot, and I think that's part of what we see. But at the same time, when, for example, he announced even before Liberation Day in February, tariffs against Canada and Mexico, 25% or even more, immediately GM and other big firms went, oh no, but wait, we have these very fragmented production chains. We are trading with our subsidiaries in North America. This is going to destroy, and there are going to be all these job losses. And there, you can see already that, like in his previous term, some of these measures, then there are exceptions that firms manage to get. And very last, I think what I showed you was, in political economy, at least what I showed you was a positive analysis. Firms, large firms, dominate the process, and they push for what's the preferred policy. I haven't said anything normative because it's not like clear. These are the large firms that are anyway the big players, and I don't want to make a normative statement. You would need a different model to say what's good or bad for welfare. What is clear is, however, that there is selection into lobbying, and it is the large firms that are dominating the lobbying game. And this is true in trade and it's true in any other policy. Yeah.
All right, so I think we had one more question, just over here. Catherine?
Thank you so much, Paola. You're one of the few people that has worked on issues linkage, and most countries are wrestling with whether to have issues linkage in these tariff negotiations. Yeah, thank you. Most people are, so Australia and other countries are wrestling with whether to have issue linkages in tariff negotiations. What does your research say for Australia? Should we be negotiating over other issues or trying to simply negotiate over tariff levels?
Still worse, yeah. So it's interesting because issue linkage was part of my PhD thesis. So I worked with Carlo Peroni on this a while back. Doesn't mean I'm not still interested. I think if you look at so at the time it was, so this was a game theoretical framework in which we were looking at whether indeed there was a debate at the time of whether we should have a World Environmental Organization joined with the World Trade Organization, because the logic was, well, there are externalities in both policies, free riding on environment. So like the problem with environment, you don't get to multilateral cooperation because you have incentive to stay out, to free ride on the environmental effort of other countries. And on trade is the opposite. You have trade blocs that want to exclude. So the logic was, let's combine the two issues so you offset this incentive. And we were showing, well, it depends. You can have actually perverse consequences. So I think even there, and it was a theoretical framework, there are conditions under which issue linker would be good for multilateral cooperation, and under some other conditions is not. So it depends on the issue also. So there was an application of that theoretical framework to trade and environment. In reality, if you look at all the trade agreements that Australia has signed, I'm sure like all the EU trade agreements and all the ones I know, these agreements, there is issue linkage in the sense that tariffs, are conditio sine qua non, meaning you have to, if you are negotiating under Article 24, tariffs have to be gone. There's a phase-out period, but all tariffs are eliminated. But then there's all these deep trade policies that are put in, that if you want are linked. And for example, the EU, it's doing that a lot. It's saying, you want tariff-free access to my market? Well, but I care about the environment, I care about labor, so we exchange market concession. You may be a small player. I don't care as much about getting access to your market, but I care about you improving your labor environmental standards. So this is done a lot by the EU. And the European Parliament is pushing a lot for this issue linkage for political reasons. There is then an issue of enforceability, like, whether actually the agreements, but anyway, I think most agreements are very deep now. So it's not the question of whether you should do it or not. It is done to some extent. But then I think, again, there are interesting issues. Maybe we can discuss this further because I don't know how much time we have. I don't have a watch.
We're pretty much
okay?
there.
Okay.
No, we're pretty much
I can talk much more about this. And you're coming for dinner, I understand. So we can have a drink and talk more.
So let's thank Paola for the stimulating lecture today. As always, we don't let the speakers go away empty-handed. We have a little token of our appreciation as well.
Wow, thank you. I can fit it in my bag still.
Now,
great, thank you.
It's also good to recognise that we can turn up here today and have the lights on and have all the technical things work, and if there are any missteps, it's typically me involved. But we have had a great team that have helped organise and support this lecture, with both Tanya up the back there and Claudia as well, and Tay as well. And behind the scenes, but not here today, was Jen Lucas, who did a lot of the early heavy lifting. So thank you to the team for making things go smoothly.
Wow.
All right, that concludes things for this evening. Our next public lecture is on August 6th, and that will be the Downing lecture. So hope to see you there.